Hello and welcome again to another Journeys with Jeff. I'm Jeff Grandy, your host, and I want to thank everybody, so many of you people out there who have given feedback about the shows. I really appreciate it. They've been very constructive and very meaningful. Our guest today has a name that is probably known worldwide, and he is he's a fascinating person, he and his family for that matter, and his name is Igor Sikorsky. And you're probably thinking of the helicopter company in Connecticut, and that was his father who founded that company. Igor was born in 1929 in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he went to Choate as a high school, and then he went to Yale Law School and got his degree in, passed the bar, has a law degree, and he's going to tell us about his fascinating journey. Igor, good to see you.
Good, glad to be here.
Thank you for being here.
Well, yes, I'm 92, so there's a lot of ground to cover. I was practiced law for many years. I'm retired now. But I've also been, because of my family background, because of my father, I've been very interested in aviation history. So I've been active with the New England Air Museum and with various other aviation museums here and also even in Russia.
You told me, though, that as far as a profession, you didn't follow in the footsteps of a lot of the rest of your family.
I was the maverick of the family.
How so?
I was just going to be independent and not, in fact, really, I think as a young kid, I was more resistant to following and using Father's name. I am now probably much closer to respecting and admiring than I was as a teenager or as a kid who made a decision, who's convinced he wanted to be his own man and not follow in footsteps. And so I did, I was not only a lawyer, but I represented plaintiffs who were suing companies. I was an employment lawyer for employees. So this put me on the opposite side of corporate America for many decades.
Well, did your father or your family push back against this rebelliousness, what they saw, or did they support you?
No, not really. They may have had a trouble understanding it. But my father was born in Kiev, in the Ukraine, which is a story in itself. But when he was born, his parents were both doctors, professional. His mother was a doctor, and for a woman to be a doctor in Russia showed a tremendous amount of conviction and her effort to be a part of the world in a good way. So Father dropped out of college to build airplanes. And his family, that was deeply involved with the education system, went along with it. They said, well, if that's what you want to do, that's what you want. All right, so we'll back you up. So as a teenager, he was 18 or 19 when he dropped out of college and then went to work starting to build airplanes. He built first a helicopter, which didn't fly very well, but then devoted his life to aviation. I would say this too, by the way, speaking of him, if I might. Father was a teenager when he learned of the Wright brothers' flight and devoted his whole life. Can you imagine being a teenager when you learned of the Wright brothers' flights and living through the entire history of aviation, and in your last year seeing man walk on the moon. I mean, this was an incredible career, and he was one of those people who had a dream and lived to see it materialize, seen it come to pass.
And his name is more well known, as you said, in Russia and Ukraine. It's a very well known name.
This is one of the most interesting and challenging aspects of this from a personal point of view. Father was born in Ukraine and began his work. Now, that was 1889, and at that time, Ukraine was part of Imperial Russia, the Russia under the Tsar. And he began his work in Ukraine and then finished working in St. Petersburg in Russia and designed and built planes for the Russian Imperial Air Force. So I had these roots in both Russia and Ukraine because I have friends and relatives that are in both nations. And obviously the pain from a personal point of view of what's going on in the Ukraine is quite painful.
Would you say that the current crisis in Ukraine is it more of a Russia's aggression, or is it Putin's?
I think it is definitely Putin's war, and I have tried to get that message across to Russia because the Ukrainians are suffering terrible material loss and deaths. But you can rebuild buildings, you can rebuild bridges, but the damage to Russia is its being ostracized, being viewed by all of the civilized world as an evil empire. And that is Putin's legacy to Russia. And the long-term suffering of being ostracized, being not respected, being really viewed as a barbarous, warmongering nation is what Putin has given Russia. So I have been sending messages to the extent I can, I was on Voice of America with a message calling on Russians and calling on the Russian army to retire Putin and end the war. The suffering, that doesn't minimize the role of Russian troops, but it is Putin's orders. And it, by the way, shows how things sometimes, when you act in ways like that, you get an opposite result. Putin wanted to weaken NATO. He's done absolutely the opposite. Now NATO is totally united and probably will add Finland and Sweden. And so Putin's actions not only have devastated Ukraine, has hurt terribly the Russian image in the world, and solidified NATO in a way that will last for a long time.
Do you think that Putin's influence, prestige will erode in terms of the military and the population, the populace in general? Do you see any stirrings of pushing back against this guy, or?
There's some. The Voice of America representative told me that they had somehow done a survey inside Russia, and they thought that 25% of the Russians were opposed to the war. Now, if 25% of the Russians were opposed to the war in the first 3 weeks. That is a very strong indication, because that was before the war sort of bogged down. He didn't have his big success, which he thought he would have, and the deaths start coming home, the body bags start coming home, and we know from our own experience with Vietnam how ultimately this turns people against the war. So, to answer your question, I think there is a body of resistance, but the only people that have the strength, the organization, would have to be, to put down Putin, would have to be what you might call a palace coup, a uprising from the inside. And that's why when I was talking to the Voice of America, and when I was, and we can still send in messages, email doesn't get blocked. So we can get email to the Russians. And my messages are to try to encourage the Russian army, or the Russian, call it the palace guard, the interior, the people who really run the Kremlin, to just retire Putin in any way possible. Now, Putin has gone on television and in very savage ways insulted, and he used a word which I'll use, but it'll be all right. Svoloch. Svoloch is son of a bitch maximum. Beyond that, it's dirty, it's that. And so Putin on TV has said, to Russian people, has said, anyone who opposes this war is a Svoloch and will spend 15 years in prison. So he obviously is goaded and is reacting. And how much beyond that we don't know yet. We do know that there have been a number of soldiers who have been taken to prison or deserted. We don't know. But they are, and the soldiers are getting all the messages because they can't block the radio that that the Russian soldiers have.
I'm sitting here wondering about, in the course of your life, in the context of your life and your education and your travels, and the political and economic and sociological struggles that you've seen, how has that affected your inner development in terms of your values and your moral and ethical values? How has that influenced you?
Well, I've spent, this is strange, it sounds strange to you, but I started out being a lawyer and representing civil rights and representing employees. And for a long time in my life, I was devoted to changing the system and improving it by the political and legal process. But in the last decades, I've come more to see it as a individual spiritual goal, and I find, for me, that's now the most important, and that's why, in a way, this is full circle. But here is my very strong emotional feeling about Putin, and here on the other side is my feeling of a spiritual search. So I've tried to say, how can you, to people that I've talked to, how can you deal with the seeing hate, like also what took place in Buffalo is another wonderful, I mean, not wonderful in the sense of good. I mean, wonderful in the sense of acute. It brings evil right up in front of us and action. And so how do you approach that and still maintain a spiritual balance? And when I talk to people, I say, the best thing you can do is, all right, you can't say love Putin, just that's asking too much. And I can't reach that stage. But you can try to approach the whole situation with compassion. So I said to some people that I knew were Polish in background, I said, look, you want to help? You want to see something positive here? Help Poland now. Poland has 4 million refugees, mostly women and children. And what could be more important than trying to help? So what I'm trying to say is that you can still try to find a positive, compassionate path in the worst situations and try to seek out a compassionate way. And certainly there's need for compassion in Ukraine, and there's need for compassion for the Poland that has to absorb. You know, we get terribly excited if we get 10,000 or 20,000 people crossing the Mexican border. Poland's had 4 million to take care of. So I think that for me is the challenge is to find a compassionate way to look at this situation.
Do you think are there paths out there? The world has many religions. You've got Christianity, you have Islam, you have Judaism, you've got Buddhism, you have Hinduism, and so many other isms. Are there, no matter where a person lives or whatever religion the person refers to, do you see anything in common? Do you see a commonality in the belief systems? Do they overlap in any way in terms of not their particular stories, you know, not their mythologies or whatever, but the moral and ethical values that these religions try to impart for the people who practice that religion? Do you see any commonality?
Yes, I definitely do, and I think you have to search for that commonality. You have to go past the myths and the stories which are the ones that are created to divide us, actually. And I think that a number of religions, including, by the way, Christianity. I was born up as a Russian Orthodox, but I think that the churches frequently separate rather than find a commonality. And I think that there is a movement. I happen to be involved with several of them, Course in Miracles and others, but the important point is to find commonality, which is the way you relate with people. Ultimately, kindness, respect, compassion, these are the signs of spiritual maturity. And I think it's an individual path. No one can do it for you, but it's an individual path that you have to follow. And every time you see someone, it's an opportunity to either display some kind of warmth wherever you are, or you can see them as an enemy. And that's the problem is or a rival. I mean, they're not all enemies, but they're so easy to see them as rivals for the material in the world. So
yeah, well, as I said before, Daisaku Ikeda, who's the president of Soka Gakkai International, that's a lay Buddhist organization, and he talks about the human revolution, and he says it's not a political revolution that he supports, but more of a revolution that needs to occur in the core of every individual's being, in your heart, in your soul, a revolution that transforms you into a more compassionate, loving person. And he said that's got to happen on an individual basis. Now that can be a daunting thought, that it's got to be an individual basis. But
That's right. That's what bothers some organizational.
well, that's where
Churches.
I wanted to ask you to share. Do you think that there's any way that the quote unquote the state, the national of whatever country we're talking about, do you think that the political and economic and educational leaders of a country can take measures to, number one, to recognize that creating a world that's a little bit more, that compassion and love and sharing are better than hate and fear and killing. And if we agree to that, is there anything that we can collectively do in terms of how can we inculcate that or facilitate that in our people, in the children, or in the population in general? How do we help to facilitate that human revolution that Sikorsky Ikeda talks about?
That's the big question, how to do it. We talked about that as a goal, but how we spread it or how we act it out, part of it is something like what you do in a program like this. You allow someone to speak clearly about religious matters. I appreciate that. I think that that's credit to you on that. Now this is going to be different, but it's where I am. I've come to the point where I recognize that there are something higher than me. Call it an angel, call it the Holy Spirit, call it, different religions have names for this. But the answer is, whenever you're upset or you have a negative thought, ask for help. Ask your inner guide for help. If you can get in the habit of doing that, now this is individual, so it doesn't really answer your question of how we spread that, but speaking honestly about it and saying that the whole answer, so there was a middle-aged monk called it practicing the presence of God. It doesn't matter what. I mean, I feel there is a guide for every one of us. And that guide, that's where I've come to in analyzing, in working with a number of different religions. I feel that they say there is a guide. Call him an angel if you want, call it whatever. So asking for guidance is the ultimate answer, but that's an individual one.
What do you say to somebody, and we've got just a few minutes left, what do you say to somebody who says, look, you're being idealistic, you're being unrealistic, human behavior since we came out of the trees, we've had wars, we've had slavery, we've had oppression, we've had racism, we've had all this stuff right up to this very moment. And it's always going to be that way. Aren't you just wasting your time?
Well, I don't feel, it's a good point, and let me just say, put it this way, when people first came down and started living together in caves, the very earliest people came up with with a way of living. They thought, if I make somebody else afraid of me, I'm safer. And we've lived with that from the time of cavemen. That's the way we function. Our whole defense system works on the assumption that if we make Russia afraid of us, we're safer, which is why we've accumulated enough nuclear bombs to wipe out humanity. So to answer your question, though, I'd say this. Putin shows us one thing. It's naive to think you can get peace by warring on another country. And you can't get peace by attacking someone else.
So which way do you lean? Do you lean toward the social Darwinists, the law of the jungle, that we human beings are inexorably shackled to this kind of behavior, to this warlike behavior, and it's inexorable. We'll never end it. Or do you think that we have it within our power, in our species, human beings, that we have the gift of reason? Do you think that we have it in our power to transcend that and do better than that? Which do you think is?
I think we can, and we must.
And
so it's because we must, I'm willing to say we can. Not minimizing or not being naive about the force, but if you compare where we were, I mean, we talk about racism, but we're 100 years off the end of the Civil War. So, yes, there has been progress. It's slow, but I am overall not optimistic, overall. But at 93, maybe I won't see it all, but your kids will.
Well, we are out of time, Igor. I just wanted one final quick question, maybe a suggestion or a recommendation for our listeners. Is there any particular book that you have read that you would recommend? If you could recommend one book that really impressed you, what would it be?
The central core of where I am is the Course in Miracles. There's also another book called Urantia, which is a spiritually channeled book which gives you the history of the spiritual evolution. And it talks in Urantia about the fact that we have evolved. We are that Ikhnaton, who first taught one God, and Moses and Jesus as a teacher. And I think that's important, that he transcends and is not limited in his wisdom to Christianity. And Buddha, obviously. All of these are movements to make humanity grow.
That's a very important point, because I do tell people that if you're right, that it's always going to be that way and there's nothing that we can do to change, then I tell people, well, in that case, Jesus and Abraham and Moses and Buddha and a whole list of others, they wasted their time.
That's right.
They just wasted their time.
You're
like
saying,
trying to teach a dog how to read. If they wasted their time.
That's right. If you say it'll never change, then you're saying that all of these people were failures.
Yeah.
And that is not true. They have been misused sometimes. That we know.
Right.
But the core of their beliefs is there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm sorry that we are out of time. Fascinating, and just a fascinating sharing of his thoughts and his ideas about his journey with Igor Sikorsky. I want to thank you very much for being on the show, And thank you, people, for listening. And please, this is one interview, and there have been other ones too. Please share with your family, with your friends. If you feel there's a message in here that's worth sharing, please spread it all and spread the word. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye-bye.